All right, guys, welcome, welcome. We will begin in a few minutes. Please take a seat. Please take a seat.
You should be a game announcer.
Oh yeah.
Well, welcome to
At
Lock
a,
Good.
at a theme park.
Yes. You're like, we're on the we can't think right now. Yeah, circle back. This table is. No, I want to be like wrong, like competing for. This is very fancy. I really love going to your siblings. They're like consistently good at life. Like I'll literally say hi to people and they will. I'm like, did I just do that? Did something happen?
You're getting sick? Look out of you. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Really excited to have our inaugural Female Founders Chat and to be welcoming Anne. I think Anne is the perfect speaker for this. Anne is a partner at NEA, and she also was an executive at Twitter and Uber. She's worked at startups scaling teams, and she also is a prolific angel investor in a lot of female founders. So great to get her investing advice, to understand her operational advice, and also just hear why she's really supportive of female founders. So please join us, and thanks for coming. Great. Is that for you? Thank you. So welcome to Launch House.
Hi, everyone. Super fun to be here. Thanks for having me. I love, love, love the fact that I can be part of your first female founder cohort. It's awesome. Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, we're honored to have you here.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about your early career, how you started out, and then how you eventually led you to NEA where you are now?
Yeah, it's a good question. How does someone become a venture capitalist? How do you cross over to the dark side, as we like to joke? Because if you cross over, you definitely think it's the dark side. So I actually started my career before tech, working in Washington, D.C. So I kind of started my career in politics, environmental policy, pounding the pavement on Capitol Hill. I then learned about this thing called Silicon Valley, where people seem to be creating these amazing solutions, products, changing the world literally overnight by building companies. And so I got really interested in entrepreneurship. And I went to Stanford for business school, and after that kind of entered the startup world. And so I did, my first couple of startups were insanely hard but amazing learning experiences. I was working on electric vehicles, EV charging infrastructure, clean tech, climate tech, the really hard stuff. In terms of building hardware, software, and kind of consumer products all bundled into one. I kind of grew up through business development and partnerships. I was always really interested in external affairs, building alliances, building partnerships, and using partnerships as kind of a point of leverage to help build companies, build products, and ultimately scale and grow. After doing my stint in clean tech, and if you know anything about the first clean tech wave, it ended in a massive bust. But I went into consumer tech because I really wanted to build products that you could immediately put in the hands of consumers, right? Like something that you would use every day that brings meaning to our lives. And that's what brought me to Twitter originally, where I led commerce, business development, and product partnerships. Happy to talk more about that. Got my first kind of taste of what a hyper-growth, successful unicorn company feels like from the inside. It's a lot more chaos than you would expect, but from the outside, it looks very shiny. And then I joined Uber when the company was going kind of through its hyper-growth phase, also on the business development team, leading growth partnerships, product partnerships, and ended up doing, tons of different roles at Uber, obviously, but really got to see the company through its hyper-growth phase and CEO transition and crisis period, and was very much at the epicenter of sort of what it was like to be inside the company when we were being challenged from a diversity and kind of equality perspective from the outside. I then joined another startup based in LA, actually, as chief operating officer. So I had a chance to lead an organization, manage different kind of functions. And then I started angel investing. And I thought at first when I started angel investing that I didn't really want to be an investor, but I saw an opportunity specifically around female founders because it was so obvious to me in my circles, in my professional networks, in my career, that female founders just were kind of getting overlooked, which is kind of insane. There's a tremendous amount of talent, including everyone in this room. And so I started angel investing in female founders a couple years ago, started working with emerging fund managers, women who were building their own funds. And that kind of ignited my interest in investing. And so, frankly, a lot of what I focus on as an investor now that I'm part of, a really well-established global multi-stage venture capital firm. NEA has an incredible reputation with female founders. We've backed more female founders than any other Silicon Valley venture firm.
Wow.
Snaps. Yes.
That's great.
Many of them actually here in LA. And in New York. But I think about this a lot, how do I use my platform, not just to be an effective investor, right, and back, interesting companies, but how do I use my platform to support emerging fund managers, female founders, and kind of create that ripple effect that I think is still really important to see in tech of women rising into positions of power and leadership and influence and capital, and how to kind of, breaking into those Fortune 100 epic public company CEO roles.
Awesome. Well, that is an amazing background. You've clearly done a lot. Can you talk a little bit about the culture at both Twitter and Uber? I read that you wrote Twitter was a little bit of a meme culture, and Uber was hustle culture. What was it like when those teams were scaling, and what did you notice were effective about those cultures, or anything interesting as it was hyper growth?
Yeah. Well, I think Twitter and Uber cultures in particular are they're as opposite as you could get. Twitter was obviously, and I think this is true for a lot of successful kind of unicorn tech companies, the internal culture kind of reflects the product, right? And what you're ultimately introducing into the world. So, Twitter had a very social, cacophonous, everyone has a voice, but it's hard to make decisions kind of culture. Everyone brought their authentic self to work, very much reflected what Twitter was about as a company. And then, Uber had a very different culture, very data-driven, very rigorous, very hustle, entrepreneurship, action-oriented, get shit done kind of culture, right? And that really suited the product, right? Because you're building and trying to optimize this very kind of transactional, real-time marketplace of rides, right? That we've all experienced. And so one of the things I've learned from seeing different, startups and tech companies is we oftentimes think of culture building in companies as what feels good to me, because we all want to be proud of the teams and organizations that we build. But I think a little bit of the secret sauce as you go on to build your own companies and, build teams and figure out how, what kind of culture you want to have in your company, to really think about it strategically. What is the right culture and behavior and norms of the team that will give us an unfair advantage for the specific product that we're building and what that requires and the market that we're going after. And that can be super different, company by company. And so I'm a little bit less of a fan of like the cult of the founder, like it's just the founder's personality like imprinted on the company. That can work to some extent and probably is important in the early days. But as you add more and more people in the team, it's about tweaking that culture to really like stand out in building, an exceptional product for your specific customer and what their needs and wants are as well.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the Women for Uber network that you built and why you had to do that and what that was like?
Sure. Well, a little bit of context first. What is this thing? So when when I was at Uber, like one of the things that I observed was that, first of all, we had incredible talent at the company. Like we hired amazing people but the culture was, kind of rewarded a certain archetype of personality, right? And so, aggressive, outspoken, willing to have open debates, et cetera. And so one of the things that I observed is that we had amazing women in the company, but they didn't quite feel as empowered. Or, like they fully had a seat at the table as much as they could. And so one of the reasons that I launched the internal Women of Uber community is just to empower women at the company and for each other, much in the same way that you're probably going to do for each other as founders here at Launch House, is, to build a peer community where we could root for each other, have each other's backs, get career advice, exchange tips. And I think when I first started it with a couple of my peers inside the company, I didn't even recognize then the power that it would have, because to me it felt like, let's get women together at the company and see what happens. And we actually ended up like very quickly growing to probably 5,000 employees globally, because people were just craving it. Like they were craving it. They needed something like that. They needed an internal community that would champion them and make them feel seen and understood and supported. But we ended up having a ton of guys join the community too, who were like, yeah, this is the change I want to see inside the company. And so it ultimately became something that wasn't just for women, but for everybody who wanted to have more sort of diversity and equality represented in the company. And, all of this kind of transpired right as that Uber was starting to go through its kind of crisis period, like bad PR and this is a toxic culture and all of that. And one of the things that I'm really, frankly, most proud of and like doing that on the side, in addition to my day job, is I think for a lot of people at the company through that crisis period, like the Women of Uber community was represented like who we like could be as a company and who we were trying to be versus the kind of really negative way that we were being, perceived externally and, the headlines. And so it was kind of a beacon for like, when we are the best of what we can be, we do have this amazing entrepreneurial, supportive, like community culture that brings people up.
Great. And then as you've been investing in female founders, or any type of founders, what are some things that are on like your scorecard that you're looking for when you're evaluating teams?
So the reason that Thea is referencing a scorecard, I do not literally have a scorecard, okay? I don't want, but I did write this blog post that was like, here's like my founder scorecard for what I look for in early stage founders. And it really came from, honestly, like my experience being an angel investor and trying to crystallize that into what I look for as an investor now, because I meet, tons of founders at all stages from seed to Series C, like every single week. And so I'm obviously happy to give some visibility into that, and then answer questions later. But the things that are really, I'm very adamant that it's like, it cannot be about pedigree. It can't be about like where you went to school or, I try to like really not focus on that at all and really think about like, what is that founder bringing to the table? And that's what I'm really trying to look for. So some of the things on my list are essentially like, do you have a really unique insight about the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Or the particular customer that you're really championing or the market that you're in? Like, a unique insight, and that could be earned wisdom from experience, like, oh, you have a ton of experience in a certain space, or it could be like life experience, like you just relate to your customer more than somebody else, but really looking for like unique insight that other people don't have that is driving you to focus on this problem space or design your product solution in that particular way. I think that's really important, because there's just a lot of like obvious problems and obvious solutions out there. So what do you bring to the table? The other thing I look for is, I think, just like the qualities that help founders push through walls and build companies. And this may sound a little bit obvious, but like grit, hustle, resilience, like all those things you need to literally push through pain, in order to build a company. And how have you demonstrated that in the past, right? In whatever you've done professionally or otherwise. The other thing I look for is sort of, a certain level of magnetism. Some people are great storytellers. Some people have just like amazing energy, just like jumps through the Zoom, right, and grabs you. But like, do you have some kind of magnetism that will allow you to attract other people to the cause? Hiring is such a big part of building a company. Attracting investors, attracting talent, attracting customers. So, kind of, do you have that, I don't know, je ne sais quoi or something, right? That's gonna help you do that. And like probably the fourth thing that I really look for is a lot of my interaction with founders is people are constantly pitching me. And we all know like nothing is ever as perfect as sort of, a pitch deck is trying to imply. So I look for like kind of self-awareness and curiosity, right? And like that intellectual ability to just either in a self-aware way recognize like, where do I need help, or what are my weaknesses, what do I need to work on, or just intellectual curiosity to kind of not always be selling but fully engage with the problem at hand and figure out like, okay, like, well, what do I maybe not get about this, and like how do I figure it out, right? And so I think founders go through so many different stages and challenges along the way that I think having intellectual curiosity and just curiosity about people really helps you kind of learn what you need to learn throughout the journey, and that's something that I look for.
Do you have any stories of founders that have like amazing grit or that intellectual curiosity in your portfolio right now, and like what did they do to impress you?
Well, I have many stories, I guess, and it kind of feels like picking a favorite child. But I will say, like, one of the things that, because this has been announced, I can talk about it. So last year I invested in a company called Contra, and they're really building kind of a very Gen Z friendly, exciting new platform for independent talent, people who want to build independent careers as freelancers or as a side hustle, et cetera. And when I first met Ben, who's the founder and CEO, he very clearly had like intense, kind of passion and curiosity about the, challenges facing people who are freelancers, because he had been a freelancer and he was just so clearly in tune with what that person was about, what made them tick, what they needed in a product, and had, could clearly champion the customer. And then he had this like crazy amount of just charisma, where it made me want to work with him, but he had already hired an amazing team, so it was very clear that he could attract other people, right, to kind of join the company, etc. And because he had the lived experience personally, of having been a freelancer, faced those challenges and persevered, he clearly had that kind of unique insight about what the next generation of independent talent needs. And kind of definitely checked a lot of the things that I was looking for.
Nice. And then what are some trends that you're looking for right now, like investing trends, and as you're looking to grow your portfolio, what types of companies are interesting you?
So I focus on consumer investing and future of work. A lot of future of work is application SaaS, and I do a little bit of climate tech. But I think, there are some really exciting trends in the consumer world right now. You're probably going to work on many of them. I mean, obviously, I think Web3 is a big opportunity, at the intersection with consumer, right? So there's a lot going on there, but things that I'm personally very excited about are essentially, how do we use DAOs as a mechanism to create communities, professional networks, right? Startups, organizations, and then what are kind of the services and products and operating systems that we need to create to support this new kind of distributed model, if you will, for how people collaborate. Tons of opportunity there. I think when it comes to consumer experiences, just reimagining I think we're in this interesting cultural shift where we don't want to collect physical things as much. Like our lives are kind of we've been there, done that, material stuff, and it's still happening. But I think this move toward, how do I represent myself digitally, right? Like what, and this could be NFTs or something else, but this idea that, you could have multiple identities online. You could have multiple representations of yourself. You could express yourself in so many different ways, either through a gaming experience or the NFTs that you collect, but kind of giving people permission to express themselves much in the same way I think we originally felt free to express ourselves through social media when it was new. But now there's this new frontier of self-expression. Whether that means finding a community that's super authentic to you or becoming literally somebody else, right? In the multiverse, whatever that is for you. But kind of, and I don't know, you are the innovators, right? So you will create the consumer experiences that really build that magical kind of sense of this is something new and I love. But I think self-expression is kind of going through an evolution right now. So that's something that excites me. And then hybrid work, integrated work life. I mean, here we are, right? You are building companies, right? But you're also having this very kind of social community experience. And as we work more from home, right? Or as companies essentially try to figure out how to create kind of community and social and connective experiences for employees in a distributed way. We're kind of blending, work and life, work and social in new ways, right? And it's less about physical space and more about where do we collaborate? Where do we build community, both with our coworkers, but also, sort of the broader professional networks that we each have. So there's a ton going on. It's super exciting. I've honestly never seen such a ridiculous amount of insanely talented founders. Everyone is building, and it's so good for the world. And I, honestly, at the end of every day, I'm I must have the best job in the world because I get to see what everyone's building and kind of envisioning, and it just leaves me wildly optimistic about the future. And so, investors don't predict what's going to happen. And any investor that does that, I don't know, call their BS. Founders build the future. We just get to be along for the ride, right? We get to be invited to the party sometimes. And so I'm really excited to see what you all build.
Oh, so sweet. And then do you have any advice, for the founders in the room who are early stage as they're thinking about building their teams, building their products? If you could go back with all the experience you've had now, what would you tell your younger self or this room of founders?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay, let me think about it for a moment. Okay, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, it is insanely hard to build a really simple, delightful user experience, right? And so I really encourage founders now, whether it's the founding team or, just someone they have in their orbit, have great designers and UX people with you from day one. It's never been easier to build a mobile app or build a website, and it's never been harder to build something that truly lives up to that Apple-esque, it's both simple and completely magical at the same time. And I think, every company that we think of as an iconic brand and consumer experience has that. The first Uber ride was absolutely magical. You're holy shit, I can tap a button and get a ride, right? Apple products were magical. Slack was magical back in the day, right? Chime is magical in sort of like the simplicity of its banking product. And there's tons and tons of other examples. But like, I think you have to really strive for that level of user experience as much as you can from the early days, and strive to sort of pull that out of your team, because the reality is like a lot of early, consumer and, SaaS products too, but they're like good, not great. And you want to build a great product, and it's actually really, really important and really, really hard. I think the other piece is just like, don't overthink it, which is like the opposite of what I just said, but I think is equally true. Like, the reality is like, if you are building for consumers, like consumer behavior is really surprising, right? People don't always, what they say they want may be different than what they actually do. And that's just a reality of consumer behavior. I'm sure we all do that to some extent. And so it's only by putting things in the hands of your users that you get real, true feedback versus, running surveys or sort of like other methods of collecting user research. So I'm a big fan of just, getting in front of your customer, whoever that is, as much as you can, getting in their heads and really thinking about the psychology of what drives their behavior and their needs and wants, and then building that kind of into the product.
That's great advice. So I'll just ask one more question, and then I'll open it up because I want it to be hear everyone else's questions. My last question is, what's your information diet? Like favorite Twitter followers, like books you're reading, things that you're learning about, favorite books, what's going on?
I'm a bit of a foreign policy wonk, which is perhaps not as relevant for this group, but I do follow a lot of tech people on Twitter. I read The Economist. I sporadically read books. And they, I'm happy to give you guys recommendations of books. I think, I try to really, frankly, like a lot of my information diet is sort of two-pronged. One is like the latest in the world, right? Because I just believe there's like, it's important to stay up to date with what's happening in the world. And when you're an investor, it's even more important. Like now I actually read about what's happening in the stock market every day. And before, like I couldn't care less. Like it just was not part of my world. But I think on Twitter, and I do spend a lot of time there, I really try to like follow a variety of voices. I follow a lot of emerging fund managers. I follow a lot of angel investors. I follow a lot of women. I, follow my peer investors, and I love learning from other VCs. Like, yes, it's a competitive game, but like I learn so much every single day from other smart people in the industry. And I've always been a big believer in like, just learn from people around you, because oftentimes you can learn more from like a peer in your industry than someone who's super famous and a celebrity. So I don't know. I'm not going to call out any specific name. I do really like Lenny's newsletter, and I recommend it a lot for founders, and I will often gift it to founders actually, because he just does such a nice job of providing resources on product management and marketplaces, and it tends to be super relevant for our consumers. So shout out to Lenny.
Great. Yeah, you just touched on peer learning, learning from other VCs. And I think that's a big thing we're doing here is learning from other founders. Like we do these talks where everyone is an expert.
Oh, by the way, sorry. First round has amazing content. Love it. Read it. Use it. It's great.
Good to know. So yeah, I definitely believe in peer learning as well. So thanks for answering my questions. I want to open it up to everyone here who has questions. So, all right. You have a question. Go ahead.
I'm curious how you would advise younger founders to bring their experience to VCs, especially some of us in the room are college dropouts or in our very early 20s, so we don't necessarily have an extensive experience or background at a successful company, for example. So how can we frame that to VCs, and how can we show that credit that you were talking about?
I think, most of us realize that if you're early on in your career, like what really matters is kind of your insights about the problem. So I think more than kind of pitching what you've already done. It's about demonstrating through the story that you're telling about your company that you really have identified a really important kind of unique big problem, right, that you're working on, and that you have some really creative, fresh ideas for how to solve it. And, you know, I think it's important to talk about your educational background, whatever it is, whatever experience you have, like, be proud of it. Celebrate it, right? Pick out little nuggets of maybe how you've stood out from your peers in the past, because, you know, like, honestly, as a younger founder, what you bring to the table is like a fresh perspective that the investors you're talking to probably don't have, and maybe the industry doesn't have, right? And so I think as much as you can demonstrate kind of a unique and fresh perspective, that's really helpful. And then, you know, any nuggets that you can pull out, it could be as simple as, you know, a school project that you worked on, or an internship that you've done in the past, or the lemonade stand you ran as a kid, right? Like, that demonstrate entrepreneurship, that demonstrate resourcefulness, that demonstrate like kind of like that, being a self-starter, right? Just pick out like examples, and don't oversell what you've done, because when people oversell what they've done and, you know, it's kind of like it's less believable, it can actually hurt you. So celebrate what you have achieved, and then just sell the vision for what you're building.
When you start to invest.
Oh, yeah, great. All right, more mics to the party.
I'm Stephanie.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. As you start to invest in the seed stage in consumer companies, what types of metrics are you looking for?
Great question. Challenging for seed, because seed is super, super early, right? And so I will be honest that at seed, I tend to emphasize, you know, traction and metrics a little bit less, and vision and person and like overall market opportunity more. Like, is this a big, exciting space? Do I believe in the person? At seed, you know, different companies, some people haven't even built a product yet, haven't, you know, are kind of raising on a deck. Other people have a few months of data, but a few months of data is rarely indicative of like the true trajectory of the company. But I think demonstrating a command of what metrics matters more than showing traction, if that makes sense, right, on certain metrics. So I look for founders being able to demonstrate a command of user growth metrics. How quickly is your user base growing month over month, week over week? How engaged are the users with your product, right? What's the monthly active users, the daily active users, weekly, the MAU/DAU, if you will. You know, it's like a ratio metric that a lot of investors use. A command of, you know, acquisition costs, right? What is your CAC? What do you think your LTV might be? And so, and then, you know, like one of the obvious ones, but it tends to catch a lot of consumer founders like off guard, is like, well, what's your retention look like? You know? And so it's not enough to acquire users. You have to think about, how do you retain them? What does good retention look like for the product that you're offering, right? And so, you know, again, at the seed stage, you typically don't have a ton of data, but I think just being able to tell investors, here are the key metrics that matter that I'm tracking for my company, here's how I'm going to be sort of tracking them going forward, shows to me that you know how to build a consumer business and gets me excited. But the other thing I look for in consumers specifically is, you know, do you have some ideas about how you can build kind of an unfair advantage into your customer acquisition strategy? Like, literally, how do you find your users? Where are they? How do you get them to come to you? You know, if you want word of mouth, like, how do you activate that, right? If you're going to use organic and paid channels, like, which organic channels do you think might work best for you? Is it TikTok? Is it something else? So having a strong point of view of like, here's how I'm going to find and bring my customers to me is really important.
So in the same vein, oh hi, I'm Tarlan, by the way.
Hello.
So in the same vein as like peer sharing, I'm curious to know who you go to for advice and how, at your early stages in your career, how did you find those mentors and those allies that really were I'm sure your advocates as being a woman in the tech venture space? There's 2 questions in one.
Yes. So I would say earlier in my career, I don't think I've ever had, I always hear these stories of like, I had this one mentor that like pulled me up at every step of my career. And like, no offense to any of the amazing people I've worked with or for, but like, I have never felt like I had like the mentor who pulled me up and like saw my potential. And like, I was very fortunate to have some just really good people who were my managers along the way. And every startup that I was part of. And so I relied a lot on my like direct managers for both learning and kind of that support, if you will, and sponsorship internally. And sometimes they met my expectations and sometimes they didn't. But, like that's the person who's like in your orbit. I will say, I think I have probably learned more from my direct peers, like the people that I was on a team with, than even my managers or the most senior executives that I had a chance to work with, like through different parts of my career. Because if you work in tech, chances are, especially if you work at, a known company, a startup, like your peers are insanely smart. Like they're great at their craft, and maybe that's design, or maybe that's product management, or maybe that's finance, or maybe it's operations, or whatever it is, or engineering, right? And like the more you can learn from peers who are great at their craft, who are even at your level, I think that's the fastest way to kind of like drive your learning curve for startups and just tech in general. And then now that I'm on the investing side, I would say I still learn a ton from my peers. Like I learn a ton from the other partners that I work with at NEA. They're great. They've been there longer than me. A lot of them have also come from the operating side. So I constantly seek their advice as I'm looking at companies. And I learned a lot from my peers in the industry. Like I will call up, women I know at other venture firms to exchange notes or to like vent about something that's happening. And I'm like, have you been through this before as an investor? Like, what should I do about it? So I definitely tap my sort of, peer network quite a bit.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. We're getting a lot of questions
All right,
now.
let's go. Yeah.
All right. Oh, okay.
Go pass the mic.
Yeah, the person who asked the last question can choose who they give it to next.
Thanks. I'm Lisa, and I'm really happy to be here. And you've given amazing advice. And I love the mentor question, but it's also about being a mentee. And so I've been knocked down a few times. I have a few years on you. And my question is about when you're knocked down. Would you mind sharing a moment when you were knocked down and what you did to rise up? A struggle, a challenge. Like, where did you have to go? How far did you have to dig?
I mean, I definitely feel like I've had many setbacks in my career and many like personal disappointments along the way of like, when I wish I had, a bigger leadership role, but I didn't. When I feel like, a male peer was getting recognition and promotion that I wasn't for doing the same thing, right? And like, without naming names, because we're live streaming and I don't want to offend anyone, but like I've had many of those moments and it frustrated the hell out of me. And I think the hardest thing in that moment is to not just like get super angry and bitter about like, oh, it's different for women in tech, because it is different. It's different for women in tech and in business and in investing and that. Right. And so, and some managers have blind spots, right? Leaders have blind spots. They're not all perfect. And, and so I guess I think the place that I've gone to every single time when I have been disappointed is kind of like a more internal place of like, I know what I'm capable of. Like, I know what I've achieved. No one can ever take that away from me, even if it's not recognized. Like, I know what I did, and that gives me a lot of confidence. And I know what I've done like throughout my career. And so like a good hack to do when you do feel beaten down is to like just sit down and think about like, what are all the things that you have accomplished? What are all the prior challenges that you've pushed through? It's gonna be a longer list than you realize, and then you're gonna be like, oh my God, I've got this. Like, no big deal. And I just keep trying. Like, you just keep trying. You will get no's, you will get rejected, you will get disappointed, and you just keep, like, I don't know, coming back the next day, and you just keep trying. And then eventually it works. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I think that's the truth.
No,
Yeah.
I love it. I think it's important to share. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Do you want to give the mic to?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. I thought it was really inspiring that you created like the women-led group at Uber. I had a question, like, where, as like a woman in leadership now, is there anything you do specifically or trends you're seeing in the VC investment space that's like disrupting or making that space more inclusive for women?
You know, that's actually going to be my answer. No, I think peer groups, relatable peer groups really, really matter, right? And so I've actually been surprised by how many like female founders have reached out to me, you know, saying, oh, hey, you know, building amazing companies, by the way, right? So like succeeding in their own right, and still reaching out to me and saying like, I just, you know, like, I wish I had like more people around me that are kind of like female founders, female CEOs at similar stages of company building. Like, I just don't really have like a group, you know, like to kind of be my ride or die crew in company building, right? So I think there's collectively a lot more women in tech, a lot more women founders, but I think for each person it can feel quite lonely. So one thing that I'm a big believer in, and I'm constantly either through introductions or dinners or, you know, meetups or, you know, just trying to do is create that connective tissue, connect like female founders to other female founders that might be in a similar space, or maybe they're both seed stage founders or Series A founders, or they're in the same city, and like helping each founder in my orbit create that group around them. Because what I've heard many, you know, founders say is just even having those like 4 or 5 people on a text that you can always ping, that are there for you, you know, that will understand the journey that you're on, can make a big difference. And I think like collectively as an ecosystem, as an industry, there's just a lot more resources around this. Like there are funds that are being built specifically to back female founders and create community for them. January Ventures, which I've been part of, is a great example of that, right? It's female-led for female founders, and there's like women operators, you know, that are being advisors, right, to those founders. All Raise is kind of an industry-wide group that's trying to create a place for female founders, and, you know, there's like a pockets of that kind of activity, but I don't think there's any substitute for having someone like on text who is in a similar stage with a similar level of ambition of what they want to achieve. Like, yes, I want to be a unicorn CEO. I want to be a public company CEO. And like, we're on this journey together. I'm not saying it has to be that, but you know,
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful.
I think it's like that saying, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most amount of time with, and that's why spaces like this are great, where everyone's like so ambitious and so supportive as well. So I agree with that sentiment. We have a few more. How are we on time, by the way? I forgot my watch.
I think we're good. We got a few more minutes.
What time?
6:53.
Okay, because she's amazing. She's going to hit the airport after this. We caught her right in time. All right, perfect.
Okay, so this is more of like a technical question. You talked about UI and UX. So I'm reading Andrew Chen's book, and he talks about how like for network of like products like Uber, the curation of the network, who's on it, why they're on it, and how they interact with each other is just as important as design. What would you say to that?
I mean, he's spot on. Obviously, I'm a fan of Andrew. And look, I think that's true for every marketplace, right? Ultimately, Uber is a marketplace, Airbnb is a marketplace, you know, eBay is a marketplace, OpenSea is a marketplace. Like marketplaces, you know, really are defined by the quality of the supply in that marketplace, right? And sometimes that's human talent, and sometimes that's a product. And so I think if you are building a marketplace, it's really important to think about, who do you kind of let into that marketplace, right? Because you want to make sure that there's a certain amount of like quality for the participants that are coming together, merchant and buyer, right? Rider and driver, host and guest. And it's counterintuitive because you get a lot of pressure to kind of grow. But the more guardrails you can put and use curation in the early days to make sure that like every experience that you're creating in your marketplace is a great experience for your initial customers is really important. And then as you scale and grow, you can think about like where to let loose, right, in order to drive some growth. But I think, products that just kind of let anyone in do tend to struggle and collapse under their own weight eventually because it just gets really like diluted. And no knock on eBay. I'm not a big eBay shopper, never have been. But like for me, eBay is like an example of like, yeah, everything's on there. But what's on there? Like, why would I go there, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for an amazing first session. I want to ask you a couple of questions on two topics that you covered. One, your enthusiasm for Web3. I mean, there's a lot of hype, and now that everyone's becoming a creator, like, where do you still see opportunity there? So that's number one. Number two, you spoke about culture and how important it is. Culture is such an abstract concept. How do you sort of objectify it?
Okay, my quick take on Web3 is like all the opportunity is still there. It's essentially been like a casino. I don't know, for like up until now, kind of like, I don't know, like if people are kind of in it, trying to figure something out. Some people are at the high roller table and winning big. Everyone else is kind of at the slot machines, just like trying to make something happen, right? So I think all the opportunity is still there because the thing that is just beginning to be figured out is like, okay, now that we have these new set of tools, right, and they're really available to anyone in the world, which is sort of the power and potential of Web3, like, how do we actually create value with this? Like, whose life experience, can you improve with the tools of Web3? If it's entertainment, like, what's an incredible, engaging new experience that people haven't had before? If it's fintech, like, okay, how do you make, borderless payments and payroll really seamless and easy in the way that a company might want to use it or an individual might want to use it? Like right now, it's still really inaccessible. The user experience for anything in Web3, I think, is really gnarly hard and isn't accessible to mainstream consumers. And figuring out how to make this work for the mainstream, make it relevant, make it useful, help it, use it to solve some problems, like that, none of that has been done today. So there's a ton of opportunity. And then on culture, like I think ultimately culture isn't like what you want your values to be written on a piece of paper. Culture is how your employees act when you're not in the room.
I love that.
Culture is the day-to-day behavior in all of those micro moments. What does it add up to? Are people collaborative or are they combative? Is your team really like entrepreneurial and self-starting, or are they like waiting for someone to give them an order? Are people learning from their mistakes, or are they being defensive, right? And so it is the aggregate behavior of the group that you work with that is the culture. And so that's why it's important to be intentional about it, because the culture exists, whether you say you have culture or not. Whatever values you write on the, like, it exists by virtue of how people interact. So kind of where do you want to take that in your company?
I'm Ashley. Thank you so much for that talk. I just have a question about Web3 and how you see going to market being different in Web3, and also how a company building in Web3 should structure themselves, whether they should themselves be a DAO or be a Web2 startup building for DAOs.
I think it depends. I think the structure follows strategy, right? Like, what is important for your users, right? I think there's a question. I think if you want to, attract capital from mainstream kind of investors, venture investors, having an initial kind of corporate structure and that first round be a traditional equity round is really helpful. we're all learning how to invest in DAOs, but it's pretty murky right now. And so if you're starting with a DAO, like you will be limited to the investors who are kind of like playing in that end of the pool right now. I think it really depends on sort of the product that you're building. And then obviously like you're gonna have to attract people, right? And so it's the most competitive talent market we have ever had in tech. Every company, doesn't matter how well capitalized they are, how hot they are, like everyone is struggling to hire the right people and fast enough to really drive impact. And so if you're really honest with yourself, like what will incentivize tech employees to come join you? Is it a DAO structure, or is it more of a conventional equity structure, right, where they have ownership, in the corporate entity? Like, I still think we're in a pretty traditional world where you're not going to pull an engineer from Google for like, you might have these tokens at some point in the future. So how do you compete for talent is a good thing to think about.
Thank you for that answer.
All right. Any other questions?
We can take one more. Bring us home.
Are there any opportunities that you passed on that you wish you would have been a part of that team and you have a little bit of FOMO and regret?
She's putting you on the spot.
Yes. I mean, I'm still kind of chasing some of those companies, so I don't know if I can say. I don't know if I want to drop names. Okay, I'll drop one. I think, there's a really awesome team. They're now based in New York. It's a company called Luma, and one of the founders is an Uber alum, so shout out to the Luma team. I think that they are just masters in building like beautiful, beautiful products. Like the first product they launch of anything is just so gorgeous and delightful, and that's really hard to do. And I think like that's a team that I feel like I missed out on, just because like I think a team that can build that well can always build something great, even if you kind of don't know exactly where it's going from the beginning.
Is this the Luma that the invite for tonight was made on?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I know, right?
And
now they have a wallet, the Glow wallet. You should go check it out.
Oh, cool. That was not product placement, but we do love them.
Yeah. I am not an investor, so it's really a shout out to an awesome team.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences with us and to be the inaugural speaker for our first ever female founders cohort. We really enjoyed it and would love to have you back anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And then we're going to boogie on over to eat now, so we'll get a little food.